Before him, Britain rarely had a victory. After him, there was rarely a defeat. He beat the French and threw them out of Portugal and Spain. He was a master at using terrain to give himself an advantage. He was the only commander to consistently defeat Napoleon's generals, and finally the Emperor himself at the Battle of Waterloo.
I'm Major Gordon Corrigan. I've always been fascinated by military leadership. In this programme, I'm looking at Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington. How was it that a man condemned as a dunce at school, and whose own mother thought he was stupid, could learn how to become Britain's greatest general?
In the late 18th century, the world was dominated by two superpowers, Britain and France, and they were at war. That war produced Napoleon Bonaparte, the greatest French general of the age, and over 20 years of bloodshed. Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, was born in Ireland, but he wasn't marked for greatness from birth. His family were minor aristocracy, but they had no money.
His mother's problem was what to do with her ugly duckling. There to be no secure baths in politics for him. As a gentleman, trade was out of the question, and the family's estates, such as they weren't the birthright of a younger son. In his mother's opinion, he was fit only for powder, and so he joined the army.
By the age of 25, he was commanding a battalion against the French. But this had absolutely nothing to do with ability. In those days, commissions and promotions were bought and sold for cash. Arthur had purchased his way up through the ranks and done precious little soldiering on the way. But there were things in his favour.
He hadn't shone academically, but he did have a sharp and inquiring mind, and he was a voracious reader of military history. But above all, perhaps, he'd decided to take soldiering seriously.
Over the next 9 years, a professionalism and natural ability began to shine through. By the age of 34, he'd earned a promotion to Major General, as well as the loyalty and respect of his superiors. He had tremendous confidence and self-belief, evident in his most famous portrait, which hangs in his London home, Apsley House.
Oh, this is marvellous.
Yes.
This is the one that's reproduced in all the books, isn't it?
Reproduced in all the books, on the old £5 note, on most of the pub signs throughout Great Britain. This pose, I think, just shows his self-assurance, his firmness of purpose, the intense stare of the eyes. It fixes you, it challenges you. People later on in life posed the question to him whether he was afraid of Napoleon and the French army, and he always said he refused to even consider the prospect of defeat.
So he always tried to make sure that he only fought a battle when he wanted to fight it, and on ground of his choosing.
And ground is the key word. Wellington used terrain as an additional weapon in his arsenal. He was a master of using ground, and two examples from the Peninsular War show this brilliance. They also show evidence of another of Wellington's great qualities, his ability to plan and think ahead.
This is one of Wellington's masterstrokes, the lines of Torres Vedras, one of the greatest feats of military engineering ever. It was built by 300,000 men, supervised by the Royal Engineers, and it's actually 3 lines of trenches, forts and gun positions that stretch for 26 miles, from the River Tagus in the east to the Atlantic in the west.
Trenches and gun positions were concealed amongst the hills. Behind the lines, Wellington's soldiers waited for the French. They were snug and safe and well supplied by the navy, unlike the French, who lived off the land. Wellington had the local people moved behind the lines with all their animals and food. He then ordered all remaining crops to be destroyed.
When the French approached, the land was bare. If they stayed where they were, they'd starve. So eventually, they had no choice but to withdraw back to Spain.
20 years of soldiering had brought Wellington to this point, and soon he would finally face Napoleon across a battlefield in Belgium. Wellington had the force of character, the self-confidence, and above all, the ability to engender tremendous loyalty from his men. Even from the Dutch, Belgian, and German soldiers, he now found himself commanding. Working with allies is a mark of a great commander, and Wellington was a master at it. He was working with the Prussians, led by Field Marshal von Blücher. Napoleon knew that he had to stop the two armies meeting, so he attacked both simultaneously. Wellington's troops came under attack at a place called Quatre Bras.
Today, the crossroads at Quatre Bras looks pretty unremarkable, but in 1815 it was key to Napoleon's fortunes. It's a strategic junction lying on the main road to Brussels and also on the communication route between Wellington's army and that of the Prussians. Napoleon committed himself to fighting two battles at once, 6 miles apart, one against the Prussians at Ligny and one against Wellington here at Quatre Bras. Wellington had to move fast to hold the crossroads, and by nightfall the French had had about 4,000 casualties and the Anglo-Dutch around 5,000.
Meanwhile, 7 miles away, Napoleon's troops met the Prussians in the village of Ligny.
A French battalion has fought its way into the outskirts of the village, behind me there. They've taken some casualties, but there's still about 400 of them left. And they're coming down this road, packed shoulder to shoulder, when suddenly, from number 42, away across the road there, the windows are flung wide and they find themselves looking down the muzzle of a Prussian 12-pounder cannon. And there's a great gout of smoke and flame, and about 200 musket balls come winging up the road and take out about 60 Frenchmen. And it gets worse. That battalion is reduced to about 300 now, but they press on towards the centre of the village. Hidden behind the church here, there's half a company of Prussian infantry. On the word of command, they swing out across the road, level their muskets and fire 2 volleys. Down go another 100 Frenchmen. But at the end of the day, numbers and experience told, and only nightfall saved the Prussians from complete destruction. They took 16,000 casualties and they lost 21 guns. But although they were roundly defeated, they weren't routed. And instead of retreating towards Germany and home, as Napoleon had hoped, they withdrew north so they could still cooperate with Wellington if needed.
It's this loyalty that Wellington was able to inspire in his allies, even in the face of defeat, that I believe marks him out as a brilliant leader.
I see you've got old Blücher up there.
Yes, and Blücher was, of course, in charge of the Prussian army.
We were lucky, weren't we, that Blücher and Wellington had this great relationship.
I think that's what was so critical to Wellington. He was a man of honesty. He did inspire loyalty, not just in his troops, but in men like Blücher. So Blücher had said to Wellington, I will be there, and be there he was.
Wellington now faced one of the greatest challenges of his career, and one that would make him a household name throughout Europe. In a repeat of the tactics he used in Spain, he would cleverly conceal his troops near the village of Waterloo.
On the 18th of June, 1815, it all came to an end here on the battlefield of Waterloo, a small, tightly packed killing field with 160,000 soldiers in an area less than 2 miles square. Wellington distributed his troops along this ridge. He was able to use the lie of the land to conceal most of his infantry on the far side, using the reverse slope to protect them from French artillery. What he had to do was stick on this ridge, allow Napoleon to attack him head on, and then hold him off until the Prussians could arrive.
At Again, Wellington would borrow heavily from his experience in the Peninsular War. Wellington, the master tactician, studied the terrain and recognized the importance of holding the 3 farms that crossed the battlefield. They were easy to defend with only a small number of men, but Napoleon believed he could now lure Wellington into weakening his centre by staging an attack on one of them.
This is Hougemont Farm. It was held by the light companies of the British Guards, about 800 men altogether. So when that first French attack erupts out of the south, it's blown away by musketry from the roofs, from the windows, from loopholes in the walls. The French try again, from the north this time. And briefly, some of them do get into the courtyard. And then it's a barroom brawl. It's musket butts and bayonets and boots and fists, until eventually the gate is closed and the last few Frenchmen still alive in here are skewered to death.
Wellington had the advantage, as the battle for the farm tied up thousands of French troops. A number of the British wounded were burned to death in the chapel here. Nevertheless, that tiny handful of guardsmen held on, and the French never did capture Hougemont Farm.
And now Napoleon threw forward his infantry. 8,500 men tramped up this slope straight for Wellington's line. They were hammered by the British guns. They were blasted by British musketry. And they were scattered by British cavalry. Napoleon's old tactical magic wasn't working. As Wellington said, they came on in the same old way, and we beat them in the same old way.
It was the ultimate test for Wellington. Would his reputation be enough to ensure the loyalty of his troops as they defended the ridge? Would Blücher keep his promise? By evening, he had his answers. The Prussians were on the field, the French were now outnumbered, and the British Guards blew them into bloody shreds.
At the end of the day, 40,000 men and 15,000 horses lay dead or wounded on that field. Even for the normally tight-lipped Wellington, it was almost too much to bear. As he said, next to a battle lost, the greatest misery is a battle gained. It was a great victory, but most of those inexperienced Dutch and Belgian and German troops wouldn't have stayed on this ridge for anyone else but Wellington. And the Prussians wouldn't have stayed in Flanders for anyone else but Wellington. Could Wellington have won the Battle of Waterloo without the Prussians? Wrong question. He'd never have fought the battle if he hadn't known that the Prussians were on the way.
It may not have been Wellington's most difficult battle, but it couldn't have been won without him. From an unpromising start, Wellington had transformed himself into a great leader and a successful commander, the only man to beat all of Napoleon's generals before finally defeating the mighty emperor himself.
Wellington never fought another battle, but then he didn't have to. Waterloo made Britain a world power, the only world power for a century. Before Wellington, there was rarely a victory. After Wellington, there was rarely a defeat. He was Britain's greatest general.